Manal, welcome to the show. Finally,
Thank you so much, Miriam. Thank you for having me.
I cannot wait to just spend the next hour or more diving into the topic of facilitation with you to geek out.
I'm excited as well, Miriam, and slightly nervous.
Which is part of the game.
Yes.
So let's start with an easy question. When did you start calling yourself a facilitator?
That is an interesting question. I started calling myself a facilitator before I even knew what a facilitator was.
This is the exact opposite of what people usually say on this podcast.
Yeah. Yeah, so I didn't even know facilitation was a thing when I started facilitating. So I started off facilitating mental health workshops, and it was just a big interest of mine. I thought there was a lot of conversations that were needed to be had, and I just started facilitating those conversations, and I didn't even know what a facilitator was until I came across the International Association of Facilitators, and it came as a shock to me that there was a certified body of professionals that actually had, rules associated with what I was doing. It was a really amazing real discovery that I had at the time, and of course I shifted my approach to facilitation after discovering the IAF.
So what exactly has changed? Because just to clarify, you called yourself facilitator before you knew that it was a profession. I find this beautiful. And so with this kind of almost, how do you call that? Almost naive mind towards facilitation. What was your imagination of what a facilitator was, and how did it change after going through a certification program?
Well, I'm not certified just yet, Miriam. But it was just meeting a lot of these professional facilitators that really shifted what I thought a facilitator was. So before that, I just called myself a workshop facilitator, and that's because I managed conversations, or I was like the person in front of the room who sort of directed where the conversation was going by asking certain questions. But what shifted for me was I now had a very structured approach to my facilitation. And so after receiving some training, for example, at the Institute of Cultural Affairs, I knew things like ORID, right? Like how to ask specific questions that can really help have structured conversations as opposed to having conversations that kind of go in circles, right? Mm-hmm. So it was a more structured approach, having agendas, like crafting agendas for a session, crafting a design, right? Having certain tools and methods that I can now use for my workshops. Before then, it was just intuition, mm-hmm. which I guess was working because my workshops were a hit, I guess you can say. But after having all of this training and learning the way different people approached it, people who were a lot more intentional than I was, it really helped hone in on how much value folks received from my sessions. So that's what changed, just having a more structured approach to my facilitated workshops, mm-hmm. as opposed to what's going on in Manal's head.
Or in the gut, which
yes.
might be the same. And as you speak, I was just wondering to what extent it's actually confidence and just ourselves. Maybe your audience, the groups, didn't really realize the big change that is going on for Manal, suddenly having an agenda and being more intentional. But you knowing that there's actually a structure behind that you can lean on and that you can use in order to almost rationalize what you've done before might be even worth more than the actual impact.
Before I started facilitating those workshops, Miriam, there was a lot of like personal factors that played in on why I started facilitating those workshops. And one of the reasons was I volunteered at the Distress Center and the Suicide Prevention Line for 7 years at the time before I even started facilitating workshops. And a lot of folks, when they hear about that, they think that most people that call in, they're on like the brink of suicide, right? But that's not the case. Most people are dealing with daily life distressors, right? So things you and I worry about daily, right? Like it's so universal, the issues that we face, and the whole idea of, you know, anxiety and fear and things that we don't necessarily like to talk about. We don't like to admit that we have. And so one of the reasons why I started these workshops was to normalize these conversations, because I've seen and heard so many of folks talking about these issues, right? So in like Manal personally knows how normal these issues are, but the majority of folks don't know how normal these conversations, these topics are. And so one of the reasons was to normalize this. And so I didn't have like the structured approach to facilitation, but I knew that my facilitation would require the element of vulnerability, simply because like I know these things, but not everybody knows these things, right? And so when I start talking about these issues, especially in these sessions, folks start looking around like, oh my, is she saying what I think she's saying? And then after a while, they notice that because I'm vulnerable, they can be vulnerable too. And they're like, oh, I deal with that too. And by the end of the sessions, like everybody is talking about these topics that they didn't even think that they would ever be vocal about in a public space, right? And so that was one of the pros of not having a structured approach when I was first entering the facilitation realm, because perhaps I might have not been trained to be as vulnerable as I thought I should be in a space that warranted that. I mean, I don't really do mental health workshops anymore, but that's how I started out off in facilitation. And when I first entered the space, I knew that I had to get over that fear of being vulnerable. And so that was one of the pros of not knowing what a facilitator was, if that answers your question. But definitely the training and being exposed to all of these facilitators has certainly added to my facilitation after having that knowledge of, you know, I need to be vulnerable. I need to get over that fear. And so I think there's pros to both. And once I combine the two, it really added to my practice as a facilitator.
Yeah. And it's a beautiful story, and I can imagine how much you learned from this time to the workshop facilitation you're doing today. And I wonder how you made the shift from being in a vulnerable one-on-one conversation as almost maybe not a consultant, but an ear. I think if someone is calling the hotline, expecting to find someone who's there to comfort them, you have a totally different role as opposed to someone who's hosting a conversation for a group of people who all need to be heard.
Yeah.
Although they might not want to speak up. So what is the shift in your own role to open the space? Also, and I might be ignorant, I would have thought that on such a hotline, you're not the person to be vulnerable. Because you cannot just open up constantly to everyone who's calling and sharing their daily problems with you. But then you just mentioned that in this workshop setting, you are.
Yeah. It's interesting that you say that there could be a vast difference, Miriam, but it's actually quite similar. So in a facilitated role, Miriam, we don't really say much. Like we don't solve a group's issues. We're not really knowledgeable in the content for the most part. what I would like to say is that we're pretty good listeners, and we like to sort of gauge that. And that's exactly what my role in the distress line was, to be a good listener. I barely said anything, right? But by the end of the call, I would get all of this praise, like, oh, you really solved my problem. I was like, I didn't say anything, right? I didn't say anything. I just provided the space. I said a couple of mm-hms and ahas. I normalized their distress, which is quite similar to what a facilitator does, right? Like they provide the space, they provide a great listening ear, they provide like certain questions that they ask to gauge certain responses and to get you thinking in a certain way. So that was exactly my role in the distress line in a one-on-one conversation, right? I barely said anything, and it was quite, it's so touching that by the end of it, people think that I helped solve their problems. And that's kind of like what I do as a facilitator now. Like, it's all in your wisdom. It's the group's wisdom, right? It has nothing to do with Manal. And in a one-on-one session, that's exactly what it was, right? Like, you have the solutions to your own problems. Manal is just here to help, right? In her really, really small way. And it always shocks me when people praise me for helping solve their issues, because I was like, I had nothing to do with any of that. That was all you.
And it's so funny because on the one hand, yes, of course. Yes, now that you're saying it, yes, of course, as facilitators, we don't do much of the problem solving. We hold the space and we ask the right questions. And as you spoke, I was also thinking, yeah, these are also the friends that we need in our lives, right? Those who are not trying to solve our issues.
Yeah, exactly.
We're just there to listen and to drop a few mm-hms and ahas and then get all the love for having helped a friend. And when you say you normalize the issue, what do you mean by that?
I normalize the issue. So this is where my interest in the topic of fear comes in, Miriam. I think one way to normalize folks' issues is by being vulnerable and by telling your own personal story. And so that's kind of the fear that I had to get over when I started facilitating these workshops. So a lot of the times people that came to these workshops, it took a lot for them to go there, right? Because a lot of people don't like to admit that they suffer from mental health issues, right? Even though we all do. And that's what I mean by normalizing, right? Let's just put it out there. Like, we all have distressors, we all have anxieties. So one way to do that is just to like make that blanket statement, right? And the second way that I've done that in my workshops is I've told personal stories, and a lot of the times people are shocked at the stories that I tell, and so they kind of look at each other and look around and, oh my, is this real? Like, is she saying what I think she's saying? And I don't tell it in a serious manner. I tell it in a very like, this is what happened, like, this is my experience, right? Like, there's nothing to be ashamed of. I totally destroy that element of shame, that element of guilt that comes with it. Because for one part, we feel ashamed that we have these emotions. We feel bad and we feel sorry for ourselves for having these emotions. And then we add on an extra layer of guilt and shame for feeling sad about these emotions, right? So it's kind of like these double layer. And so I destroy that element of shame. Like, this is normal. These feelings are normal. So you need to eliminate that element of shame. And then I just talk about my own personal experiences. And it's quite beautiful, Miriam, to see how folks start opening up. And like, for the most part, they explicitly say, I never thought that I would ever say this, right? And I'm shocked myself. And I've been to these workshops for so many times, and there's always like this one rugged guy who doesn't really display emotions, and he's saying that he would never say this. He never said this ever, but you're saying this in a public space with strangers that you met for the first time. Like, it's just so, like, sometimes I try to hold back not crying during these sessions, because I know how freeing it is for someone to just let that go. And for someone to say that in a session that I'm facilitating is the reward for facilitating those sessions. And when I was doing those mental health workshops, Miriam, like, that wasn't my job. Like, this was all volunteer basis. I was not getting paid for it. So that was kind of like my reward, to give someone that level of freedom that they could vent something like that. And I don't know how to describe it, but to give someone, not necessarily to give them, but to provide a space where they could vent that and have that little bit of freedom is totally rewarding.
I bet it is. And I wonder whether it's actually easier to open up and to admit this vulnerability in a space where it's normalized. So we know we are all here because, at least deep inside of us, otherwise we wouldn't be here, we do feel that we have these emotions as well, otherwise we wouldn't be there. And knowing that most probably we don't have to meet these people again. Because I think showing emotions, and especially shame and guilt, is something so cultural and intimate. So someone's shame is something we feel shame, I think, towards those who are closest to us, easier than to a public, right?
Yes. Yeah. And you're definitely right about that. Sometimes those closest to us, we don't necessarily tell our deep, dark secrets to. And I think that's one reason why you hear about all of these interesting stories about like Uber drivers, right?
Yes.
And how Uber drivers, like, you just vent to them, or they vent to you, because you'll never ever see them again, right? So there's so much to be said about that. There's so much to be said about that, Maria.
Yeah. And how have you then pivoted from holding space to these almost self-help groups or almost therapeutical groups? No, before we are getting there, let me ask a different question, because you explain how you open the space and how you provide the environment where everyone can be vulnerable is by going first and by normalizing. So, hey, folks, listen up. Okay, nothing to be ashamed of. This is all normal. I feel that, you feel that. And even if you don't admit it, you will feel that too. I get that. And then how do you close it? So would you keep the slightness throughout the session and then close with the slightness? Or is there still a moment where you have to kind of close the box, show gratitude for the space that this is not normal to share that much?
I think most people know, like, outside that space, not to they don't feel comfortable sharing it. And for one of the sessions that I held in a religious group, actually at a mosque, and religious groups actually don't like talking about mental health issues, right? As you can imagine, there was a lot of pushback to hold these sessions. But it was quite interesting, Miriam, because when I finally did get around to actually publicizing these workshops, there was so much interest in it, simply because, like, topics like this aren't discussed, right? Because in religious spaces, you're not anxious, right? Like, you're supposed to show gratitude to your creator, right? Like, all of these like really outdated theories. And even in our holy scripture, like, there's actually a verse that says human beings are born anxious, right? So I've taken those types of things, and it actually says, like, when you look around the world today at all of the issues that we're facing, right, it's hard not to be anxious, right? And so in our religious scripture, it actually says human beings were created anxious. And a lot of these folks that are in these religious spaces, they don't factor in verses like that, right? Because we're supposed to be grateful and we're supposed to be all these sorts of things. But after having like this interest in this topic, there was actually a need for these sessions to be held monthly. And so now like these sessions are held monthly. And so because folks know that you can't be this level of vulnerable in every workshop that you attend, right? And so this provided folks with a safe space once a month to come and be themselves, I guess you can say, and be vulnerable and share their anxieties, right? And share a space where they could vent and where they could talk about these issues in a safe space. And so I think a lot of people know not to be this vulnerable in every space that they enter. And so that's why there was a need for these sessions to be held, and someone like me to help facilitate these sessions that could offer a space where they could be vulnerable.
Yeah. And I can only imagine this extra layer of shame that comes in, or even guilt, that admitting that we're anxious within any institutionalized group as religion, because the moment where you admit being anxious, could it be interpreted as a lack of trust? If I'm anxious, then maybe I don't trust that God will take care of me. If I feel these feelings towards my partner or towards my family, does this mean that I doubt their love and I don't trust their support? So I think there's a lot of, related to these feelings, a lot of expectations and maybe non-verbalized expectations.
Yeah. Yeah, I never really thought of it that way. Maria, you're raising really interesting questions. But I think a lot of people don't like admitting that they're anxious because exactly what you just said, right? Like if I admit I'm anxious, I'm also admitting that I don't have faith in my creator, right? Because I don't feel like he'll take care of me. But like God himself says that human beings were born anxious. And I feel like if you're not even the slightest bit anxious after watching the news, there's something seriously wrong with you, right? Like you have to be anxious. There's so much horrible things happening. And if you're not even slightly remotely feeling a certain type of way after watching the news, not that I recommend watching the news all the time, but
feeling anxious all the time.
Yeah, or feeling anxious all the time. But that, like all change agents, right? Like that's why they're change agents, because they feel this anxiety of, we need to change something, right? Like this world can't go on the way that it's going on. We need to help drive change, right? Like you need a little bit of anxiety to help fuel that change process, right? And so I that's how I like to think about anxiety. Like I don't think all anxiety is a bad thing, but I definitely do think we need to talk about like anxiety not running your life, right?
Yeah. And I think there's, as you said, I totally plus one that that anxiety is something positive. If we boil it down, we need it as a human species. We need a level of anxiety to push us towards our limits. If we wouldn't be afraid of anything, then we might be too comfortable to change something.
I agree with that, Miriam. Like even workshops work, right? and never done before. Like I need to create a community where all facilitators can benefit, right? Like you need that level of like, I need to make some type of change happen, right? And then that's what fuels your passion, and that's what fuels you to create, something beautiful. And I think like most art is like that. And we could go on and on about this. Like, I think there's definite benefits to anxiety, but I also think that we need to manage it, right? And that's why we have things like meditation and movement and painting your boyfriend's house, right? So all of these things that help manage our levels of anxiety.
Yeah, and I think how we speak about them and the place we allow them in our lives. As you said, I love the concept of normalizing as you explained it. It's okay, it's there. It's just someone who lives with you in your kind of house between your ears, and give them a space, not too much. And sometimes they're shouting, they're like, oh yeah, thank you for the reminder. Might want to prepare a little bit more, might want to watch out not to do any mistakes. And that's enough, right? Just like we speak to our moms.
Yeah, yeah.
We're always there with an extra portion of worries. And
yeah, I love the idea of normalizing it. And I've definitely had to jump over a lot of like fear hurdles in order to get to a space where I feel comfortable just talking about my experiences. But I genuinely feel like when you are yourself, it like genuinely and unapologetically yourself, it's a sort of invitation to let others be themselves as well. And that's kind of like what my experiences have shown, right? Like the minute you're yourself, Manal, and you get over that fear of being yourself, then it's such a beautiful invitation that lets other people be themselves as well.
yeah, and there's this beauty that we sometimes forget. I I'm thinking of a dancing workshop where we had to need to share that, where we had to stand in rows facing each other in two groups, and it was solo jazz dancing. And I love to dance, but I don't really feel comfortable dancing by myself. I love couple dancing.
Yeah.
So, yes, I have a leader who leads me, and I love to follow. I'm the perfect follower. Well, still something to learn, but you understand the thing. And there was in this solo jazz dance class, and I felt so uncomfortable. And then I looked at the row in front of me, and they had to dance for us. And I realized that those who just made me smile and feel good about watching them dance were those who I didn't even look at how they danced. They were just those who enjoyed themselves and dared to be themselves. And those who were kind of maybe tense but had the perfect moves, I didn't feel that spark. And I had this huge light bulb moment beyond dancing that, okay, it's not about how we are doing things or what we are doing, it's how we show up to do them. And that night I solo danced.
That's beautiful.
I was just enjoying it because I realized nobody cares about how I dance anyway, especially not when I dance for myself, right? And I cannot step on someone's toes.
Oh, that's beautiful, Miriam. And that's exactly a lesson that one of my friends tries to teach me, except she's a phenomenal dancer. So, so I have to take her advice with a grain of salt. But for her, like dancing is true liberation. And she's like, you don't have to even be like slightly or remotely good. It's just the whole idea of movement and just being comfortable with your body and being at home in your body. And she's preaching liberation about dancing, whereas me, I'm exactly like you. Like I don't like to solo dance, and I don't think I'm a great dancer as well. But she's definitely allowed me to see that there is liberation and freedom in just being at home in your body and not caring about what other people think. And I talk about fear a lot, and she's like, Manal, if you want to like totally embody fearlessness, like just like be the first person on a dance floor at a wedding, and then you've embodied this fearlessness, because that's true liberation.
Yeah. Yeah, and you will spark and invite others to follow just by being there.
Yeah.
So how do you bring that to the workshops you're now doing for clients? Because I think what you used to do or what you're doing in your voluntary life, you're the same Manal and you're this authentic person. So I can hardly imagine that there's much that you do differently when you work for clients, maybe in corporates. And these more serious workshops, maybe not, but maybe more, how would you call them? How did you make the transition?
Well, it's somewhat similar, Miriam, but in a more, I'll use your word, serious context. So right now, I'm mostly, especially in this past year, I've mostly been doing community development projects, and community development projects, and some of the sessions, it's folks who look like me. Folks who look like my mom. And I never thought that I would facilitate sessions with people who look like my mom and who want to see their community impacted and changed, simply because when I was growing up, I lived in project housing, and my mom, not that she didn't take an interest in our community, but because like there was nobody that she could relate to. But now in my sessions, people feel comfortable talking in the sessions, and they talk sometimes in my language, and it's I don't know how to describe it, because I've never saw someone who looks like my mom be in that type of space and and talk about these issues that would impact the community. But now that they see someone who looks like me, they feel comfortable entering the space. They feel comfortable sharing their ideas for a better community, their ideas on how to impact the community, their level of confidence in talking about these issues, which my mom is not confident at all speaking in English to in any space, right? Even though she knows English, like she just feels a little intimidated. She feels uncomfortable because she's never been in a facilitated session with someone who is facilitating the session who looks like me, right? And so I show up in that type of way, not necessarily in the way that I showed up in my mental health workshops, but in the way of looking like Manal, I guess you can say, which is somewhat similar to the mental health workshops, because it's showing up as myself. And it's quite beautiful to see those that are impacted by the decision be in the decision-making process. And which is one of the reasons why I facilitate these community development projects. And one of the reasons I facilitate, period, right? Like I facilitate participatory decision-making. And if I'm facilitating community development projects, but people from the community aren't part of the facilitated workshops, then I question how impactful these changes are. And so seeing people from my community be in a facilitated workshops and do like a consensus building workshop, and then take these ideas and then go back to their communities and impact the change, like that is very powerful to me. And that is one of the reasons why I'm a facilitator and why I love participatory decision making. So if that makes sense, Maria, I know I've kind of gone on a long rant.
There's so much to unpack. And although I would have loved to dive deep into the topic of visual appearance, someone who looks like my mom versus someone who looks like Manal, I will now decide to leave this box there and maybe come back to that another time, because I think what you mentioned about the participatory decision making with and for people like your mom independent of their maybe visual appearance, they look like her, but maybe more they are like her in a way that they don't feel confident in speaking English. They might not feel confident, period, as immigrants, maybe from a lower social class. So, and then to guide this process to first build this confidence for them to speak, to be part of the decision-making process, and then even to go a step further to become an ambassador of this decision and then a change maker. So this is a huge growth path that you set in motion. What does it take? And what would you have wished to know before you started?
What does it take? It's quite heavy, actually, because sometimes I feel like I'm not impacting as much change as I'd like, and then sometimes I feel like I'm giving myself a lot more importance than I do have. In terms of what do I wish I had known, I think part of this process is getting over my own self-doubt and my own like lack of confidence, I guess you can say. I think there's a lot of intersections with me, like just growing up, like hijabi, Muslim, Black, like all of these intersections. And I think I've always been in spaces where I've been the minority, and that's kind of impacted, I guess, my confidence in a way. And I'm totally like in that space every time I enter any sort of setting that I have now. But I've also learned that I think everybody thinks they're the underdog, like regardless of what they look like. I just think everybody thinks they're the underdog. And I think I use my intersections as one reason why I believe I'm the underdog. But I think this is one reason why I've felt a spurt in my confidence levels, just being aware of the fact that everybody thinks they're the underdog, Manal, and everybody comes with like the self-doubt and like all of these anxieties. So just enter a space and be like your full authentic self, and just try to empower people as much as you can. And one of these people are, you know, people who look like my mom, right? Whenever I enter like these community development workshops, and generally everybody in general, right? Sorry, someone's sneaking in. But everybody in general. And so like that's one way that I approach these situations, and one way that I get over my fear.
So how do you empower this? How do you facilitate this empowerment? Because it's not only vulnerability, I guess. It's because confidence maybe grows with vulnerability and realizing that we don't die if we are vulnerable.
How do I empower? Most of the times, especially when I was first starting off, Miriam, I didn't feel empowered at all, but I faked it. I totally faked it. I psyched myself up. I meditated before my sessions. I, you know, sniffed some essential oils. I kind of told myself some affirmations. And eventually, even when things do go awry, you start to realize that it's not the end of the world, right? Like you don't die. And you don't die. And that sort of grows on you. And I feel like that's a large part what happened to me, at least. Like I just, and after every session, you just expand your comfort zone just a little bit more, right? And I think people really pick up on this energy. And I've gotten to the point where like right now I'm just all about like, let's boost this person up, right? And I feel like people really pick up on that energy, and they kind of sense that genuineness, and like finding, like, even if it's like a microscopic detail about someone, and just growing that. And that's kind of what I do for all of my facilitated sessions. So it's it's whether that's, putting them in breakout rooms and giving them opportunities to, grow this like microscopic detail about themselves. Whether it's using certain tools and methods that allows them to be a little more vocal about the issues that they're facing. And hopefully by the end of it, like they'll become a little more empowered, right? And but just generally, Miriam, I think people sense the energy that we bring into a session as facilitators and as people in general, right? Like any space that you enter, right? And yeah, so that's kind of like how I empower folks.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. It sounds like really these mini steps in giving every individual space and time to find this superhero, even though it might be just a miniature inside of them, and to express it and to grow it,
Yeah.
put some nutrients and some water on it and share it.
Yeah, and it all goes back to like my training at the distress center, right? So when folks start talking about themselves, like what detail did they share about themselves that you could help grow, right? That you could empower them with, that you could help facilitate the change process for them, right? Like this isn't about Manal helping them, right? It's Manal listening in on those small microscopic details about something that they themselves have mentioned, and then giving them the full power to help grow whatever like thing it is, right? Whether that's like some small detail that they mentioned. It's like, oh, you mentioned this about yourself. Why not do a little more of that? And then they start thinking, right? And it never occurred to them to do it simply because like it's been normalized for them, right? But for me, like it's something new that I'm hearing about them, right? And then they start to think, and then and then they empower themselves, right? And it had nothing to do with Manal, right? And I think that's the best way to help facilitate change. Empowering someone else in their own change process, right? Not Manal telling people what to do, right?
Yeah. And I think in our exploration call, you said something beautiful, like giving a voice to the voiceless. And this process of empowerment that you just explained, and helping the individuals, the participants of your workshops, to become more vocal, sounds like in line of giving a voice to the voiceless. What is it about this phrase, and how does it impact your work in general, how you approach your facilitation?
Well, giving a voice to the voiceless was kind of like my somewhat cool way of saying participatory decision making. Miriam, I really believe in participatory decision making. Like, so the first question I always ask before like delving into any project is, who is impacted by the decision, and how can we include them in the decision making process? And that just goes back to like my own personal upbringing. Like growing up, like I always saw folks making decisions for me that look nothing like me, right? So sometimes I'd see a panel of men talking about women issues, right? So it's kind of like, I'm sure you've seen that. And it's kind of like, why are they talking about women issues? Like, why isn't it a panel of women, right? Or a group of like religious scholars talking about the hijab. And it's like, can we get people who are wearing the hijab talking about the hijab, right? Or a panelist talking about, Black issues. And it's like I've seen this like growing up, and it always annoyed me. It always kind of like threw me off. And even like recently, right, like we see people talking about Indigenous issues, and there's nobody who's Indigenous from the Indigenous community in these settings. And so giving a voice to the voiceless is kind of like my cry for that, right? Like sometimes I don't need to be involved in the conversation, right? And I'll gladly step back if the issue doesn't involve someone who who isn't me, right? Or who doesn't look like me, or if the issues don't impact me. And so participatory decision making is something that I'm truly passionate about, because it gives a seat to people who are impacted by the decision, right? And I think that's one of the most effective ways that change could be facilitated, right? And change could be made when those who are part of the change process are in the decision-making process, right? Because they've included what's important to them, and they've included what changes need to happen in order for positive impacts to be had, right? So that's kind of what I meant by giving a voice to the voiceless, because I feel like a lot of the time as a society, we don't give like a voice to people who are part of the issues that we're trying to confront.
And I wonder, when I hear participatory decision making, I would be very curious to hear, where does participation start and where does it end? Because I'm thinking of a situation that I faced working in an intercultural, multicultural, multinational environment, but it was all European, where the Germans love to have conversations with everyone. So everyone is included in the discussion, but at the end, one person takes a decision. The French don't have, at least at that time, didn't have this conversation before. So if they were invited around the table with the German, they thought that now they are part of the decision making, although they were just part of being heard and contributing. So I wonder, where is the balance? What does participatory decision making actually mean? And how fluid is it?
Wow. Okay. So your example, Miriam, I'll have to sit on. I'll have to sit on that. But one really beautiful example of participatory decision making is a recent project that I worked on, and it was a community development project, as a lot of my projects are nowadays. And it was for a program that actually empowered the citizens or the residents within the community to impact change themselves. And so the program started off by providing trainings to these residences on leadership skills, right, on how to start certain initiatives. And then these residents actually went back, and then they kind of gathered a group of within their community to help impact that change. So they were the change agents within their community. They weren't being told what to do. They were given the skills to impact change, right? And so like that is participatory decision making. And then they were able to take these leadership skills and train more of their community to these skills, and then impact change on their level. And so it wasn't us saying, you know, this is what you need to do in order to change your community, right? So they were part of the process of like, this is what's needed within our community. Like, we live in the community and this is what we need. And then they were able to take the skills that they were trained on, and then they were able to actually impact those changes that they wanted themselves to see.
So it's, if I understand it correctly, it's less about the process that guides, or it's less about the decision that is being made and more about the process of empowering people to actually take decisions.
Yes, and in the beginning, like it's so powerful, Miriam, to like see in the beginning they were kind of like timid and shy, and like they didn't think that they could impact change, right? But after the training, after weeks of training, like they're like, we can do this, right? And so let's do this. And to see someone like, that's why I was saying, like, someone who looks like my mom actually speak like that was quite empowering to me, because when I was growing up in project housing, my mom didn't do any of that, right? Simply because these programs weren't available, and they weren't accessible. I don't think they were available. I've never heard of it. But it's quite empowering to see that. And so that's what I mean by participatory decision making.
And it's then honest, because you're not empowering someone as a, how do you call that? The whitewashing. You invite someone at the table, now you can take the decision with us, but this person might not actually have the skills or the knowledge or the ability to actually articulate what they mean, or they won't have the infrastructure to actually connect to the broader community to then report back and to really represent the community in this decision-making process. And then it can become very hypocrite, actually, to invite someone. Oh, we need this Black person, and we need this woman, and we need a maybe non-binary person, and we need whatever around the table, so that they're all part of the decision making.
Yeah.
But they all haven't been trained to what the decision is about, and then they all shut up.
Yes, awesome. Yeah, beautiful summary, Miriam. And I think a lot of the things that we see now, especially after all of the events that have been happening, is very like performative in the exact sense that you described, right? And so it's like putting a woman in a leadership role but not really raising her salary, right? And it's things like that. It's like, okay, she now has the title, thank you so much for that, but can we also raise her salary, right? So it's very performative, like you just want the world to see that you're doing these things, but you're not necessarily acting on them. And that's kind of like what I'm seeing a lot of. But this project that I recently worked on definitely spoke, like practice what they preached.
Yeah. And then putting someone in a leadership position without raising the salary that's sad. Definitely.
Yeah.
What I find even worse is to put someone in a leadership position without them having the skills. So we're thinking of the early days of affirmative action in South Africa, where suddenly you need to have Black people in leadership roles, but they didn't have access to so many years of the education they would need. And then you put someone into a position where they're prone to fail.
Yeah.
And then it becomes really dangerous. So taking this more holistic approach to what diversity and inclusion and participation and leadership actually means. It's beautiful. So with everything, this was very political. Maybe we're going to cut that out. Anyway, with all the debates about diversity and inclusion that's still going on, what do you think that most, let's call them corporates, or most people who call for more diversity and inclusion get wrong?
Well, one situation that I'm dealing with, and I think a lot of folks, like, they don't understand what it means to be anti-racist. I don't think most folks take a proactive approach. I think they play it safe by saying, oh, I'm not racist, and then they leave it at that. But I think you have to take like proactive measures. And what I'm hearing from a lot of my Black colleagues is like these topics are like out there, Miriam, but they still don't feel comfortable speaking to their white colleagues about it, simply because of like they don't understand what like anti-racist is. Like they don't understand what being proactive is, right? And I can think of probably a handful of white colleagues where I can have like these super difficult conversations with, and who would be super open to actually discussing it. Whereas the rest, I don't think, like, I don't even think that I can bring up these topics, because they'll take offense to it, because they'll say, oh, well, I'm not a racist, right? And it's not about being a racist, it's about being anti-racist. And yeah, I don't think a lot of like Black colleagues still feel pretty comfortable talking about these issues, even though it does seem like it's super, super normalized at this stage, right? Like we're seeing it everywhere, and we're seeing a lot of folks like be a lot more educated about it and like do a lot of readings on it. But I still don't think that these topics can be talked about as comfortably as we like to think that they can be, that they can be talked about, if that makes sense.
So what is missing? So what I hear is that a facilitated conversation is missing so that we can talk about these issues. So what would it take? How would such a conversation look like so that diversity and inclusion program would deliver on what they promise or actually have an impact?
There's this amazing book that I always recommend. And in the beginning of the book, Miriam, like it's super, it keeps it really real. and it can get really uncomfortable, like especially as a white person reading it, like you'll cringe. And it basically says, like, if you're looking for these conversations to be comfortable, it won't be. If you're looking to feel good about yourself after these conversations, you won't. You'll feel terrible about yourself. And reading that, even as a human being, like it doesn't matter what race you are from, you don't want to have a conversation where you'll feel like crap at the end, right? Like, come on, like nobody wants to feel crappy at the end. We all want to feel good. But I think after these conversations, it's something that like you've become so accustomed to, like privilege being one of them. You're so accustomed to certain privileges that you don't even take into consideration, that you don't even think that it's considered a privilege. And then by the end of it, you just feel like crap that you've been sitting on this privilege, but you were so unaware of it. And I think that's what they mean by, one of the things that they mean by, you know, when they say like, you'll feel like crap at the end. And I don't think a lot of people want to feel like crap at the end. I think people tend to personalize it. And they start to feel like they're a bad person, if that makes sense. And it's hard not to personalize it. And I think that's one of the things that people need to get over in order to have constructive conversations about this topic. And I think that's kind of like the wall that's preventing us from having these constructive conversations, people taking it personal and people not wanting to feel like crap, if that makes sense.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
And I think that's also at the core of every argument that we have with our loved ones, that we take things personal.
Yeah.
And we don't want to feel like crap in the end. And we have all this cognitive dissonance of having this self-image that we try to keep up, although our behavior totally contradicts.
Yeah.
And we don't want to see it and everyone else sees it. So what's the name of the book? First question.
The name of the book.
Otherwise, we put it in the show notes.
Yeah, we can put it in the show notes.
Yes.
Yeah.
And
Dancing on Live Embers was the name of the book.
Live Embers.
Yes. So we can also put it in the show notes. Yes. Yeah.
And how do you facilitate these? Because to come back to the topic, everyone is talking about diversity and inclusion. We need more of that. And then nobody is willing to have the conversations that make us feel like crap. How do you facilitate these? How do you make it easier? Maybe not during the conversation because it's a difficult conversation, but to start it and to have an outcome that will lead at least to an epsilon change.
The thing about these conversations is it's never forced. So every time I facilitate these conversations, it's people who want to have it, who are coming in with an open mind, who still say pretty controversial things. But I think those that really need to be in the conversation aren't in the conversation. So one way that I help prepare for these conversations is through surveys, qualitative surveys, and just making folks aware of how their workplace, for example, feels about these issues, right? And giving them like that data that they can sift through, because a lot of people, they don't think that their colleagues think a certain way, but somehow like surveys give people a little bit of courage. Anonymous surveys give people a little bit of courage. And I think sometimes like it takes people by shock at some of these results that surface, and it's I don't want to say sad, because I think like I like the truth, even if the truth is like quite painful to share. But that's one way that I help prepare for these conversations. But like I said, Miriam, a lot of these conversations, like they're never forced. Workplaces never force like their workers to have these conversations, at least not from the sessions that I've facilitated. And the ones that attend the sessions are the ones that have a genuine concern and genuine need to change. But I feel like the ones that need to be there, they're not there. So I'm not sure how to answer that question.
What makes a workshop fail?
What makes a workshop fail? Well, that's an interesting question. I'm trying to think of the opposite question of what makes a workshop like win in my books. And so the opposite fail. So what makes a workshop win? I'll answer that question and then I'll answer your question. What makes a workshop win? I think for me, like the feedback that I always smile at is when people feel totally comfortable being themselves, when people are themselves, they can express what they think and feel, they're in a comfortable setting, so they don't reserve anything, they don't hold back. So in the opposite respect, what makes a workshop fail is if I've contributed in a way that restricts people from being themselves, that makes them reserved, that doesn't allow them to speak on issues that they would speak on, whether that's not putting them in breakout groups, whether that's not taking into account certain energy levels, whether that's not preparing them in advance to talk about certain issues, any way that doesn't allow them to be comfortable enough to share. That's what would make a workshop fail for me. And I can think back to one facilitated session where I didn't take into account the time factor, Miriam, and it was really rushed. And one participant actually said, like, I'm not contributing anymore because this feels really rushed. And so I really felt like I failed that session. A, because she explicitly said she would no longer contribute because of the time factor, but B, like if you don't feel, like I felt like she didn't feel comfortable, like just at the pace of the session. So that was a failed workshop for me.
Thank you for sharing that. How did you react, and what did you still have time to act on this criticism?
Yes. So what I did for that workshop is, so I was introducing a lot of things in that session, and she just felt like the learning curve was really steep. And so she really needed time to process, which I didn't factor in at the session. And so I stopped the session. I stopped the session and I felt like she was speaking for like when one person says it, it's not just one person, right? And so I acknowledged the fact that it was rushed. I apologized, of course. And so we scheduled another session. And in between the session, I sent out a survey and a one-pager, sort of giving a little information on the topic that I introduced, and so that they had time to process so it was a prioritization exercise, and so for them to get familiar with the matrix and for them to process it. And so I allowed for that, and then a survey for them to really give their input and their feedback. And then I sent a one-pager of the survey results. And so by the next session, they had all the information, they processed it, and then they were able to have that conversation and that discussion. And so so that's kind of how I navigated that failed workshop. But like in general, to answer your question, when people don't feel comfortable, that's a failed workshop for me. And that definitely, like, I felt like I could have done better in that workshop.
Again, thank you for sharing that. And I think having a participant actually raising their voice and saying it is already something, because they feel comfortable enough
Yeah.
that to say it and to be hopeful that they will be changed, that they will be heard.
Yeah, I hope she felt heard.
Because a person who says, I won't contribute anymore,
Yeah,
is someone who still has the expectation that she could be heard if she contributed.
that's a nice silver lining to it, Miriam.
Yeah, and it's actually what she's saying, because otherwise she would just have shut up, right?
Yeah,
And not
true.
contributed, but she wanted you to know.
Yeah, true.
So there was hope.
Yeah, I'd rather them be vocal about it than
Yeah.
just hold it in. Yeah.
And I think it's generally, especially that the opportunity now with all the online sessions, that we don't have to squeeze all the teaching parts and all the learning parts into a session where we are all together. Why would we? Everyone can read.
Yeah, true.
And read it in their own time.
Yeah, and I think just generally as a facilitator, that's kind of like my downfall. I'm a little too ambitious in my sessions. I'm like, let's see how much I can cram in.
And there's so much we want to share, and yeah, and there's always too little time.
Yeah.
Do you have a favorite exercise?
Yes, I do. It's definitely the consensus building workshop. And the consensus building workshop, Miriam, I learned it from the Institute of Cultural Affairs, and it's just magical the way that it works. So just to give you an example, so it's usually like I usually do it in like public engagement workshops where people are thinking of like countless ideas, and you can take like 100 ideas and then theme it into like 3 themes. So it's quite beautiful. So everybody first, like just individually, like in paper and like pad, just thinks of like, how do we solve X problem, right? And then they just write down however many ideas. Then you put them in groups of 4, for example, and then they cross out similar ideas, right? And then they just have like groups of 4's ideas. And then we just we put it on like a virtual whiteboard now, right? Since COVID, usually we put it on a wall with Post-its, and then we group the ones that are similar, right? So let's say we have 100 ideas, and then we group them into like themes, like which ones look similar. So let's say that there's like 10 themes that are somewhat similar. And then from the 10 themes, and then we group them again into like four themes. And then the 4 main ideas, we name them. So the group actually names them, right? And when the group names them, then we do a prioritization exercise if need be. Like if we don't need 4 themes and we need one idea, then we prioritize it into one idea. And what I love about the consensus building workshop is that every idea is taken into account, right? So from your individual idea to the group's ideas to the entire plenary, like everybody's ideas is taken into account. So you can't exactly say, oh, my idea wasn't factored in, right? Like your idea is part of that. Like not one idea gets left behind. So in terms of like a change agent's perspective, like there's ownership, there's buy-in, there's commitment, right, to whatever the end result is. And it's just super magical. Like how do you take 100 ideas and then come out with like one thing to execute on, right? So that is my favorite exercise, and it's so magical. It's so magical. Like just seeing it unfold in front of your eyes. Like in the beginning, it looks like absolute chaos, Miriam, because you're like, where is this going, right? Like even as a facilitator, you start wondering, like, is this gonna go anywhere? But by the end of it, like it gets themes into these beautiful, organized themes that the group themselves comes up with the names for, right? So it's all them that does it. And like I said, like it has commitment and buy-in and all that sort of thing. And so that's my favorite exercise. And anytime that I can get to do a consensus building workshop, I make sure to like squeeze it in.
Nice.
Not, yeah.
No, I'm curious. Would the group stay the same over this process? Or would you mix them up for them to exchange ideas across groups?
No, they stay the same. Yeah, they stay the same.
And how long do you factor in for such a exercise?
I would say minus the prioritization, because that's a whole different session. But for a consensus building workshop, I would say a 2-hour session would be sufficient. So quite short for such a, like what seems like a very extensive process. Yeah, so very short for what seems like an extensive process.
Wonderful. Thank you for sharing that.
You're welcome.
I had to sneak some practical questions in. And I cannot believe that we already spoke for a bit more than an hour. Is there anything that is close to your heart that we haven't touched upon yet?
There's a lot of things that are close to my heart, Miriam. So one of the quotes that I actually have in my office is by Vincent van Gogh. And a lot of people think I'm scatterbrained. Like if you look at my lifestyle, they're like, how are you able to do so many things? And it's because of this quote that I'm able to. And the quote is, love many things, for therein lies the true strength. And whoever loves much performs much and can accomplish much. And what is done in love is done well. So when you ask me, is there anything in your heart that we haven't touched on? I'm like, there's a billion things, Miriam, but we'll leave it at this. I love to read. As you can see, like I have like an entire library, and for the past like 3 years, I've been reading 100 books a year. So, yeah, so there's a lot going on in my mind, and I love a lot of things, and I try to incorporate like one thing from every book that I read. And so there's a lot of things in my heart, and but definitely the topic of mental health is something that is very close to me. I think when it can seem like a very like soft topic, but I think that when we focus on our overall happiness, we can be effective in so many things in our lives. And I think people really undervalue how important personal happiness is. Like when we're happier, we're more productive, we're more efficient, we're more good with ourselves, we're more good with the environment, we're more good with like others, our partners, our families. And when I talk about mental health, people don't understand the idea of happiness factored into mental health. And so, yeah, so that's kind of like the basis of everything that I go by.
Mm. Thank you. So much more to explore then. So if you had, if there's one message to the audience, maybe they zoned out and zoned back in over the course of the hour conversation. So what is the one thing that you would like them to remember from our conversation or beyond?
I know this is going to sound so like generic and cliche, but life really begins on the other side of fear. And I think we talked about this. I think whatever you fear, like life really begins when you confront that fear. And I know it's going to sound like super like, oh, Manal. And, but I don't think a lot of people understand how important growing that comfort zone is to your overall well-being, even like not just like your professional life, but to your overall well-being, like your physical, mental, emotional, spiritual health, and financial health. Probably, perhaps, maybe it could be in the professional, yeah, as a result. So yeah, that's kind of like my message.
Yes, I can totally hear that. Otherwise, we stay in our comfort zone, as we discussed earlier in our conversation, even today, that anxiety pushes us. And often it's an undefined fear of something that isn't even real, right? It's just something that we blow between our ears
Yeah.
To an extent that it's not rational anymore. And then when we confront it, when we do it, we're like, oh, that was it?
Yeah, exactly.
And then our body remembers and it will become easier and will become more confident and happier, as you say.
Yeah, exactly right. I mean, think about like your friends' anxieties. You probably like roll your eyes like, seriously, girl, like, are you seriously anxious about that? Like sometimes you need to speak that way to yourself. Like, seriously, Manal, like, is that what you're fearing? Right?
Yeah. Wonderful. So I am very much looking forward to your workshop about fear.
Thanks, Maria. Thank you for that plug. It's like nudge, nudge, Manal.
Yes, I need a few ears to hear that as a nudge. Thank you.
Awesome.
For
Thanks so much,
so
Maria.
openly, and for the wonderful work that you're doing.
Thank you so much, Maria. Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
Giving a voice to the voiceless.
And for everyone who wishes more inspiration from Manal, I put all the contact details in the show notes.
Awesome. Thanks, Maria.
Thank
Have a good one. Take care. Bye.
Bye. Dum, da, da, dum.